She had only needed a little help, just a small gesture to remind her that she still mattered. Eleanor had not planned on going to the bank that day. Her knees ached from the change in the weather, and the chill in the air did no favors for her heart. But the pharmacist had looked at her with those pursed lips and worried eyes, saying they couldn't hold the prescription without payment. So she had pulled her shawl tighter, clutched the small paper bag, and walked out. By the time she reached the steps of Crescent Bank, her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from something older, heavier. She thought maybe Victoria would understand. After all, she was family. Family helps. Family listens. Eleanor waited in line, her eyes downcast, ignoring the polished marble floor, the cold air conditioning that bit at her joints. It used to be a familiar place. She remembered attending the ribbon-cutting ceremony when Victoria took over the branch. Back then, Victoria had hugged her tight, called her Nana Ellie in front of all those investors. That felt like another lifetime. Today, Victoria stood behind the sleek glass counter, dressed in navy blue, her nameplate gleaming as if it belonged to someone important. Her hair was pulled back tightly, her lips painted a precise red. When her eyes met Eleanor's, they didn't soften. There was no greeting, no smile, just a slight lift of an eyebrow, as if she'd seen something unexpected, maybe even inconvenient. Eleanor stepped forward anyway, forcing a weak smile, her voice nearly a whisper. "Victoria, honey, I'm sorry to bother you. I need $100, just until Monday. My check clears then, I promise." She even added, "I'll sign whatever you need." For a moment, Victoria didn't speak. She just blinked, leaned forward slightly, and then she laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that echoed through the bank lobby like a slap. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was the kind of laugh that humiliates. Customers turned. A teller paused mid-count. Eleanor felt the air shift. Victoria placed both her perfectly manicured hands on the desk and said slowly, each word landing like a stone, "This is a bank, Eleanor, not a charity. If you're looking for a handout, maybe one of your old friends from the clinic can help you. Or maybe check the back of your pill bottle. There must be a helpline." Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just stood there, taking in who her daughter-in-law had become. Her voice, her jewelry, her nameplate, so polished, so cruel. Once, Eleanor had seen potential in Victoria. She remembered the early days, when Paul brought her home for dinner, nervous and proud. Eleanor had thought, maybe, just maybe, this woman would be good for him. But now she wasn't sure Paul would even recognize her. Eleanor gave a slight, barely audible nod, said, "Thank you," and turned to leave. The weight in her chest grew heavier with each step. Her shoes squeaked on the tiles as she walked out. Shoulders slumped, the bag of unpaid medicine clutched to her side. Outside, the sun was bright, but she felt none of its warmth. On the sidewalk, she stopped, her heart beating slow and uncertain. She had raised Paul to be kind. She remembered staying up late, sewing patches on his Boy Scout uniform, bringing him soup when he had a fever, teaching him to say please and thank you. But somehow, in the shiny world he had married into, kindness had become old-fashioned. It wasn't about the money, not even about the medicine. It was about standing in a place she once called safe and being treated like a stranger. No, like a burden. She walked past the pharmacy without looking in, past the corner diner with its checkered booths, past the church whose bell no longer rang loud enough to bring her peace. She had no destination in mind. She just wanted to get away from something she couldn't name but felt deep in her bones. Have you ever known that silence? Not the kind you hear, but the kind that lives inside your ribs, the one that creeps in when someone you love looks through you instead of at you. That day, Eleanor didn't need words. Victoria had already said enough. When Eleanor returned home that evening, the sound was the first thing she heard: the sharp laughter, the tap of heels on polished floors, and the soft clinking of toasting wine glasses. The air smelled of roasted garlic and warm butter, the kind of scent that used to mean comfort, celebration, something shared. Now, it was just a reminder. Paul had mentioned earlier in the week that Victoria was hosting a small get-together for one of her team leads. Just a few close colleagues, he'd said absently, his eyes glued to his phone, never once looking up at her. He hadn't mentioned the bank, Of course he hadn't, and Eleanor didn't have the strength to ask if he even knew. She set her purse down silently on the bench by the door and slipped off her shoes without a word. From the kitchen, she could hear Victoria's voice carrying into the living room, crisp, controlled, charming, the voice of someone who knew how to command attention. Eleanor made her way toward the kitchen, where she belonged now, or at least where she no longer felt in the way. The kitchen still held a faint trace of cinnamon, though she hadn't baked in weeks. A bottle of lemon verbena soap sat by the sink, Victoria's favorite. Her own rose-scented soap had been pushed to the back, half used. Even the smells weren't hers anymore. She picked up the carving knife, her hands steady despite the weight in her chest, and began to slice the roast chicken she had seasoned that morning without a single word of thanks. It didn't matter. She didn't cook for gratitude anymore. She cooked because it was the last part of herself that still felt real. As she arranged the slices on the serving platter, footsteps sounded behind her. Paul stood in the doorway, a half-empty wine glass in his hand. He looked tired, or maybe he just looked away too often. "You okay?" he asked, but his voice lacked intent, like a question asked out of habit. She nodded. That was enough for him. He didn't stay. He never stayed anymore. "Victoria says we're short on glasses. Can you get a few more out?" Eleanor nodded again. No resistance. No need for it. She handed him the platter of chicken. "This looks great," he said, a compliment tossed over his shoulder as he disappeared back into the laughter. For a long second, she just stood there. The kitchen no longer looked like the one she remembered. The spice rack had been reorganized, her handwritten labels replaced with neat, printed ones. Her tea mugs were gone, stored in a box in the garage, replaced by modern, stemless glasses that looked elegant but felt cold. Even her old wooden step stool had been put away in the pantry, as if it were an eyesore. She retrieved it now, setting it gently near the pantry wall, and sat down. Her lower back ached. Her palms felt raw, dry, and tight. She stared across the counters at the space where her life used to happen, where Paul used to sit as a teenager swinging his legs, stealing pieces of fresh-baked bread, where her husband used to whistle while he fixed the broken drawer pull. Now, the silence was deafening. She got up again, opened the cabinet, and gathered the wine glasses Victoria had asked for, thin, expensive, cool to the touch. For a moment, her eyes caught her reflection in the cabinet glass. Tired, empty, a woman fading into her own walls. She carried the tray carefully, navigating the corner from the kitchen into the dining room, where the lights glowed gold and the room buzzed with practiced laughter. The table gleamed polished wood, flickering candles, plates already laid out with appetizers. She set the glasses down gently next to the unused place settings. Victoria leaned in as if to thank her, but her words were sharp and rehearsed. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said, her perfume strong and unforgiving. "Just don't linger too long, please. Some of the guests might not understand our arrangement. I'd hate for there to be any confusion about who's hosting tonight." Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't nod either. She simply turned and walked back to the kitchen, the door swinging shut behind her. Through the frosted glass, she could still see their silhouettes, Victoria's hand gesturing mid-story, Paul laughing softly at something someone said. It all looked like a magazine spread, like something meant to be admired, not lived in. Eleanor sat back down on the stool, resting her hands in her lap. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the night she moved into this house, thinking she was coming back to her son, to her family. But that illusion had chipped away, piece by piece. It wasn't her home anymore. It was just the place where she slept, where she waited, where she remembered what it meant to be needed and realized no one here remembered with her. Later that night, after the guests had left and silence had settled back into the bones of the house, Eleanor was alone in the dining room, clearing away empty plates and crumpled napkins. The room smelled of stale perfume and half-finished laughter. A wineglass had shattered near the fireplace, its pieces scattered like forgotten confetti, sharp and glittering in the candlelight. Eleanor moved slowly, methodically, her hands trained in the silent ritual of cleaning up after people who didn't see her. She didn't hurry. She didn't sigh. She just gathered. The clatter of plates in the sink, the soft rustle of napkins folding into her palms, was almost meditative. But then, Just as she was reaching for a lipstick-stained napkin hanging off the edge of the table, she heard it Victoria's voice, low and unmistakable, drifting from down the hall. Eleanor froze, her fingers closing slightly around the fabric. Victoria was on the phone, either unaware or uncaring that her voice carried. She was laughing, the same sharp laugh that had echoed through the bank lobby days ago, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to joy, but to power. "She's turning into a walking cautionary tale," Victoria said, her tone laced with amusement. "I swear, if I ever end up like her, somebody please just shoot me. I'm serious." The person on the other end laughed too. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, her heart steady, her breath shallow, like someone who had already heard this in a dream and was now watching it play out in the light of day. She carefully collected the broken wine glass from the floor, gathering the pieces and dropping them into the trash. Not with anger, not even with sadness, just with decision. That was the moment. Not the bank, not the dinner party. That was the moment something inside her clicked shut, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Victoria's voice continued, fading into another room. Eleanor turned and walked slowly to the hall closet. There, behind the winter coats and dusty boxes, was the small travel bag she had packed weeks ago. She had left it half-zipped, unsure of when she might need it. Now, she zipped it the rest of the way. The sound was soft, but it echoed louder in her ears than anything Victoria had ever said. She placed the bag by the front door and stood for a moment in the hallway, taking one last look around, not to mourn, not even to remember, just to confirm this was no longer hers, this was not her home. The walls no longer echoed her voice. The windows didn't carry her light. Even the floor beneath her feet didn't welcome her steps as it once had. Everything had shifted, quietly, and now she was simply occupying a space that had already decided to forget her. She didn't cry. She wasn't hurt, not in the way Victoria might have imagined. It wasn't about wounded pride or resentment. It was about something much deeper. The recognition that some places can't be fixed and some people will never meet you where you are, no matter how much you bend. She went to bed that night without saying goodnight. Paul was either asleep or pretending to be. Victoria's laughter had long since faded into the whisper of digital screens and crisp, high-thread count sheets. Eleanor lay on the mattress, staring at the ceiling, her back to the door. The suitcase was ready. Her heart was, too, somehow, prepared. Not angry, not afraid, just done. At 5:12 in the morning, before the sun had colored the sky, she dressed in silence, folded the note she'd written the night before, and placed it on the kitchen countertop next to the spare key. It simply said, "Thank you for letting me stay." Nothing more, nothing less. She stepped outside just as the taxi rounded the corner, its headlights catching the glint of the Porsche in the driveway. The morning was still gray, the world not yet awake. She didn't look back. There was nothing left in that house that hadn't already been taken from her in pieces. As the car pulled away, she leaned her head against the window, watching the place she once called home disappear behind trimmed hedges and perfectly aligned entry lights. It felt like looking at a stranger's house. And for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor exhaled, not from weariness, but from release. She didn't know what came next, but she knew it would be her own. The motel room was quiet, almost sterile, but Eleanor found a kind of comfort in it. The wallpaper was faded, the carpet was thin, and the kitchenette smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant. But for the first time in years, no one was expecting her to play a part. No one was watching her as she moved, no voice trailing her with criticism disguised as politeness. She unpacked slowly, methodically, folding her clothes into neat piles inside the drawers of a dresser that didn't squeak when it opened. The room had one small window that looked out onto a used tire shop across the street, where sun-bleached flags fluttered gently in the breeze. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't cozy, but it was hers. She made a cup of tea from the motel's plastic welcome basket, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the silence settle over her shoulders like a shawl. No footsteps overhead, no voices in the next room. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of her own bones, reminding her she was still here, still standing. On the third day, she decided to check her old P.O. box, something she hadn't done in months. She took the city bus to the downtown post office, the same route she used to take when she worked full-time at the clinic. The driver was new. The seats had been reupholstered. But the rhythm of the city hadn't changed. The stoplight still blinked for too long. Pedestrians still crossed in half-jogs, and Eleanor still recognized every corner, every crack in the sidewalk. When she opened the box, there it was, a single manila envelope wedged inside, her name written in Caroline's familiar, cramped handwriting. Eleanor stared at it for a moment, her fingers hesitating before pulling it out. The envelope felt different, heavier, as if it held not just paper, but time. She walked 2 blocks to a coffee shop she used to frequent with colleagues, back when they were still colleagues and not memories. Finding a quiet table by the window, she opened the envelope and pulled out the contents. Inside were quarterly statements from the Eberlicht Systems Fund, documents she had long forgotten, funds she had once helped start in church basements and community centers with nothing more than folded flyers and shared conviction. There was a letter, too, in Caroline's concise but precise tone. It simply said, "It's time. You hold 48% of the voting shares. The total value, including all rollovers and property trusts, is listed below." Eleanor's eyes landed on the number, and she went still. $684 million. She read it again, then a third time. The coffee shop around her faded, the hiss of the espresso machines, the murmur of students, the scrape of chairs, it all blurred behind the roar in her ears. Not from fear, not from panic, but from something else. Something like an awakening. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the second document, a revocable trust, unsigned, with her name as the principal executor. She could liquidate. She could reinvest. She could walk away. But the power, for the first time in decades, was hers again. At the bottom, in Caroline's careful script, was one more line. "When you're ready, Eleanor, just say the word." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the envelope in her lap, her tea growing cold beside her. She thought about the years she had spent shrinking, first from grief, then from concession, and finally from someone else's definition of family. She thought about the mobile clinics, the early mornings organizing vaccination drives in parking lots, the mothers who brought in their undocumented children, the elderly who arrived with nothing but hope and a hospital card. Back then, she and Caroline had only wanted one thing: for people to live. Somehow, over time, that hope became a structure, and that structure became a legacy. But she had stepped away, believing she was done, thinking family would be her final chapter. But now she realized she had mistaken silence for peace. She folded the papers carefully, slid them back into the envelope, and placed it in her purse. She didn't know what she would do yet, but she knew how she would do it. Not with noise, not with fire, but with a silence loud enough to shake the ground beneath those who had forgotten who she was. It was 3 days before Eleanor made the call. It wasn't hesitation. It was deliberation. She wanted to let the truth settle in her bones, not as a fantasy, but as a fact. She wanted to feel it completely, that she could act, that she still had agency, that her life was not finished being lived on her own terms. On the morning of the 4th day, just after sunrise, she sat by the motel window with a fresh cup of tea and dialed Caroline's number from memory. The phone rang 3 times before that familiar voice answered, steady, composed, with just a hint of conspiracy behind it. "I was wondering how long you'd take," Caroline said, no greeting necessary. Eleanor didn't smile, but something inside her loosened. "I'm ready," she said simply. Caroline didn't ask how she was. She never did. That was her way, no needless sentimentality, no softening of reality. "The papers are in order," Caroline replied. "The board approved it. Your reinstatement will be quiet. No press, no announcements, but you'll have full control of the legacy funds, including Crescent." Eleanor felt her breath steady. She wasn't here to make noise. She was here to make an impact. That afternoon, they met at a small coffee shop near the college campus, the kind that smelled of old wood and burnt espresso. Caroline was already sitting at a corner table, files spread around her like armor. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with gray, but her eyes were just as sharp, just as unforgiving. She didn't get up to greet Eleanor. She simply slid a folder across the table. "This gives you full control of the Eberlicht Ethics and Oversight Council," she said. "It also grants you the authority to redirect funds at your discretion." Eleanor opened the folder, scanned the documents, and nodded. No performance, no hesitation. "What happens if Crescent loses its federal backing?" she asked, her eyes still on the papers. Caroline took a slow sip of her coffee. "It collapses, quietly, like paper left in the rain." They didn't speak for several minutes after that. The coffee shop hummed with students typing on laptops, professors arguing over tenure with black coffee, but at their table, there was only movement in the silence. Finally, Caroline leaned forward. "If you're going to do this," she said, "do it clean. Let the system expose itself. Don't shout. Make them feel the absence when the lights go out." Eleanor nodded. She understood. This wasn't about revenge, it was about return. That night in her motel room, she sat cross-legged on the bed, her laptop open and the documents spread out beside her. The first thing she did was authorize a silent transfer of funds, redirecting the stream of subsidies that propped up Crescent's financial outreach program, the very one Victoria had used to fund her so-called initiatives. For years, that branch had hidden under layers of language buried inside mobile health support grants, community incentives for elder care, and local investment matching clauses. No one noticed the details because they were designed not to be noticed. But Eleanor noticed. She always had. She issued a digital request for access to internal audits and sent an encrypted message to the Eberlicht compliance team. Within 48 hours, the first thread began to unravel. No names, no accusations, just numbers. Numbers that no longer added up. Numbers that pointed, without shouting, to something rotten beneath the shine. She filed a second request, this time for a full review of Crescent's partnerships involving senior loan programs. She needed to see what Victoria and her sister had been doing, who they had targeted, how deep the rot had spread. The files came back faster than expected. Dozens of loans issued to women over the age of 65. Astronomical interest rates. Inflated clauses hidden in footnotes. Collateral claims written in legalese designed to confuse. Every signature was there Victoria's. Candace's traced in blue ink, underlined with authority. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her heart slow and steady. They had built an empire on the backs of women they believed would never fight back. But they had forgotten that even shadows remember the shape of the flame. She wasn't here to tear them down. That part would come naturally. She was here to plant something better in the space they thought they owned. By the end of the week, Eleanor initiated the plan for something new, something separate from Crescent, separate even from the polished image of Eberlicht. She didn't want a program that looked good in brochures. She wanted a sanctuary, a place where women like her, women who had been ignored, manipulated, and quietly erased, could sit, breathe, and build again. She called it Whitaker Cummins. The name came to her without hesitation, pulled from the memory of her grandmother's town in North Dakota, where front porches were open to everyone and no one asked why you needed help. They just passed you the cornbread. She filed the paperwork for a non-profit LLC under that name, backed by a quiet, charitable trust Caroline helped set up, one that couldn't be traced back to Crescent or its affiliates. Every form was reviewed line by line, not just by legal staff, but by Eleanor herself. Her eyes didn't miss a single clause. Every signature was intentional. Then she contacted 3 women she hadn't spoken to in over 20 years, former financial counselors she used to share the clinic hallways with, women who once handled everything from housing vouchers to disability claims with patience, strength, and a terrifying precision. She sent them only a one-line message. "I'm building something that should have existed a long time ago. Will you help me?" All 3 responded within hours. Yes. No hesitation. Eleanor didn't cry, but she did pause, for a moment, at her motel desk and allow herself to feel the weight of what that yes meant. She was no longer alone. Whitaker Cummins would be a space not just for financial reinvestment, but for re-education. One that explained the fine print in plain language, that held workshops for grandmothers raising their grandchildren, for widows trying to keep their homes, for retired nurses still drowning in debt they never fully understood. It would need a building, Of course, one already equipped for financial services, preferably one that Victoria would soon be forced to vacate. But Eleanor wasn't watching the clock. She was planting seeds, not pulling up roots. Still, the system had begun to buckle under Crescent's feet. Monday morning, a subtle notification went out. A funding stream had been paused. Nothing dramatic, just a brief alert on the internal server, the kind only compliance officers see, and only if they're paying attention. But someone did. By noon, Crescent's internal monitoring software flagged 2 inconsistencies, then 5, then 13. None of them made a sound, but they all whispered the same thing. Something was wrong. Caroline's compliance team had done their work well. They didn't accuse, they didn't alert. They simply allowed the math to reveal the truth. On Wednesday, Eleanor submitted a second report, this time with audio. Weeks earlier, she had started recording her interactions in Crescent buildings, a habit left over from her years in public health, when documentation saved lives. One recording, in particular, stood out. It was a hallway conversation between Victoria and her assistant, Elise. Victoria had laughed again, that same brittle, cutting sound, and said they should start denying approvals for clients over 70. Not worth the risk, she'd said. When Elise asked if they should review existing files, Victoria had replied, "Why bother? Those women barely remember what they signed." Eleanor didn't flinch listening to it again. She uploaded the recording through an encrypted Dropbox, addressed anonymously to the Office of Financial Ethics in Reno. No context, no explanation, just clarity. By Thursday afternoon, Crescent's senior management called an emergency session. Candace was a no-show. Victoria arrived late, and according to internal reports, said very little. By that evening, word had spread that their father, who owned the majority of the legacy stock, had quietly walked out of the building, briefcase in hand, his face unreadable. Rumor was, he'd cashed out completely. Eleanor didn't need confirmation. She didn't even need the headlines. The silence had already begun to speak in ways the loudest voice never could. She stayed in her motel room, drank her tea by the window, and watched the traffic go by under a setting Sunday. Her computer chimed. A new message. The audit had been escalated. 3 more accounts were frozen. She didn't smile, she didn't sigh. She just closed the lid and went back to her thoughts. This wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming space. And she wasn't done yet. By Friday morning, the atmosphere inside Crescent's headquarters had thickened with a tension so dense that even the junior staff could feel it. Whispered conversations echoed through the marble hallways. Emails were reread 3 times before being sent, and office doors clicked shut behind meetings that used to be casual check-ins. Employees who once smiled with confidence at the reception desk now looked down, nervously checking their phones. The regional vice president made an unannounced visit that day, and for the first time in 5 years, Victoria canceled her weekly networking brunch without explanation. The tremors were spreading, and Eleanor, calm, deliberate, kept moving beneath it all like the current under a frozen lake. That afternoon, she met with Caroline and the Whiteacre Cummins legal team at a private office 2 towns over. One they'd rented under a shell LLC to avoid attention. The plans were nearly finalized. The nonprofit structure was secure. The board members approved. The funding traceable and clean. It had all been shaped carefully, not with vengeance, but with vision. They had even selected the tentative location, a mid-sized office building that once housed Crescent's subprime lending division. The lease was up in 6 months. If things kept crumbling as they were, Eleanor would have her building long before that. They discussed the curriculum they would follow, how to build financial literacy without shame, how to teach older clients to spot manipulation, disguised as kindness, how to restore a sense of dignity without calling it charity. Caroline suggested running memory clinics in partnership with retired social workers. Eleanor added the idea of survivor circles, intimate sessions where women could share their experiences without fear of judgment. This wasn't just about money. It was about returning the language of power to those who had been denied it. That evening, Eleanor sat by the window in her motel room, watching the neon sign flicker across the street. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady. As if she were finally walking on ground she could trust. Her phone buzzed once. A message from someone she hadn't heard from in years, a former Crescent teller named Rhea. who had left quietly after what she once described as one too many buried contracts. The message was brief. "I know what you're doing. If you need someone on the inside, I'm in." Eleanor stared at the screen, her heart serene. She hadn't expected allies to emerge, but she wasn't surprised either. Quiet injustice always leaves witnesses. She replied with 3 words, "Not yet, soon." Then she set the phone aside and sat in the quiet for a long while. Across town, Victoria was also watching that same quiet unfold. Though she would never admit it, she had started to feel it, a pressure she couldn't name, a hollowness in her routines. Emails that used to bring approvals now brought audit requests. Calls from corporate were colder, clipped, full of questions instead of praise. She blamed market instability, internal politics, everyone but herself. But beneath her confidence, doubt was beginning to seep in. Why were certain files inaccessible? Why had Candace stopped returning her messages? Why had her father, who had always protected them, started moving meetings without telling her? Victoria still walked with her head held high, still wore her navy blue suits like armor, but something in her eyes had shifted. She had built her world on control. And now, that world was trembling, and she didn't know who was shaking it. Eleanor didn't gloat. She didn't even whisper her name into the cracks. That was the point. The silence would speak for her. The truth didn't need a banner. It needed space. And she was creating it. With every form filed, every fund redirected, every seed planted in the soil of justice, she was creating a new legacy, not the one Crescent had promised in its glossy brochures, but the one built in the shadows of survival, whispered between women who had learned how to wait. No more waiting. Eleanor wasn't knocking on closed doors anymore. She was building her own and leaving them open. The next week began not with fire, but with paper crisp, official, and quietly devastating. Eleanor received a secure email at 9:04 in the morning. The subject line was simple: Level 4 deferred compensation, state under federal review. It was the portfolio Candace had proudly curated, the one Victoria called her legacy package. Now it was flagged for investigation by the Office of Financial Oversight. The flagged indicators were technical signature inconsistencies, timestamp mismatches, interest rate anomalies, violations of the Senior Lending Transparency Act. But behind every data point was a woman, someone like Eleanor, or worse, someone who didn't live long enough to question what she'd been made to sign. Eleanor read the summary twice, then printed it out, setting the still warm sheet next to her oatmeal, untouched and cooling. Her hands didn't shake. She was past that now. She was in the stillness that comes after you've survived the worst kind of storm, the one where you doubt your own worth. She placed the document in a folder labeled Foundations, then opened her laptop to finalize the first phase of the Whitaker Cummins public launch. There would be no opening party, no keynote speech, just an announcement quietly uploaded to a discreet web page. It included a short video, nothing dramatic, just an invitation from her, sitting in a modest office, explaining what the program would do and who it was for. Her voice was calm, warm, and unassuming. She ended it with a line she'd practiced 100 times. This space belongs to the ones who were never supposed to make it this far, but did anyway. She clicked publish. At that very moment, Victoria was standing in her corner office, staring at a spreadsheet that refused to balance. The numbers were shifting out of alignment, minor variances she couldn't account for, names on contracts she didn't remember signing, funds that had quietly disappeared. Candace wasn't returning her calls. Her father's office was closed. The branch manager's assistant had been unusually quiet all morning. A chill crept in, not the chill of guilt, but a deeper, colder one. The kind you feel when you realize you've lost control, and worse, that someone else watched it happen. That afternoon, Crescent's compliance officer requested a full copy of Victoria's communication history, emails, call logs, internal memos. It was standard protocol, nothing to worry about, they said. But Victoria knew the truth. Protocol was just the prelude to consequence. She paced the office, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, her breath tight. She thought of the bank lobby weeks ago, of Eleanor standing there in her simple coat, asking for $100. It had been a moment of irritation, a flash of embarrassment. But now it felt like a crack in the glass. Something had started there, something small, and she hadn't been paying attention. Victoria poured herself a glass of water, but didn't drink it. Her phone buzzed. A notification. Compliance review escalated to Level 2 regional oversight involved. She set the phone down without reading further. Across town, Eleanor was sitting in the park near the university, a place she hadn't visited in years. The trees were older, the benches freshly painted, but the breeze still carried the same soft whisper. She watched a group of older women gathered near the community garden, laughing at something one of them had said. She didn't know their names, but she knew their faces. She'd seen them in clinics, in church basements, in food bank lines. She had been one of them. She still was. And now, she was working for them again, not with stethoscopes or syringes, but with the slow, powerful work of rebuilding. Her phone chimed. A text from Caroline. The VP has requested an independent audit. We're weeks ahead. Eleanor replied with a single word. Good. She stood, stretched her back, and began to walk slowly toward the bus stop. The sun was setting behind her, casting long shadows across the path. But Eleanor didn't mind the shadows. She had lived in them long enough to know they always point toward the light. The news broke on a Tuesday, not with headlines or television broadcasts, but with a silent wave of digital notices that spread through Crescent's internal systems like a slow-burning fuse. The senior lending portfolio was frozen indefinitely. Compliance had traced irregularities back nearly 6 years, naming dozens of affected accounts. An emergency, closed-door board meeting was scheduled. Victoria was summoned but given no agenda. When she arrived, the room was already half full, and her seat, the one she had occupied for nearly a decade, had been moved one place to the left. Not removed, just relocated. She sat anyway, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. They spoke around her, never to her. When her name appeared on the third slide of the internal audit presentation, she didn't speak, not out of humility, but because, for the first time, she had nothing to say. Her mouth was dry. Her world, once built with elegance and precision and power, was beginning to dissolve at the edges. Across town, Eleanor was sitting in her new office, a modest space above a co-op grocery store with mismatched furniture and windows that overlooked the street. The lease had been signed that morning. Whitaker Cummins now had a home. The paint on the walls was peeling. The elevator shuddered. But the building was solid, and now it belonged to them. The first workshop was already scheduled. Know Your Rights, Financial Education for Women Over 60. Eleanor had written the curriculum herself, staying up late with old textbooks, policy guides, and voice memos she left on her phone while walking through the park. She didn't want it to sound academic. She wanted it to sound like survival, like memory, like clarity. A knock came at the door. One of the volunteers, Nina, a retired mortgage officer, poked her head in and smiled. The coffee's ready. They're starting to arrive. Eleanor felt herself stand, slowly smoothing her blouse. Her joints ached, but not like before. This ache had purpose. She walked out into the main room, where 6 women were already seated, chatting nervously over styrofoam cups. One of them looked up at her and smiled shyly. "Are you Eleanor?" she asked. "I heard about you from Elise." She said, "You know how it feels." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, I do." The woman patted the seat next to her. "Then come sit with us." So she did. She didn't stand at the front. Not today. She sat beside them. She listened. She asked questions. And when one woman, her hands trembling, her eyes tired, admitted she'd signed something she didn't understand 10 years ago, Eleanor leaned in gently and said, "Then we'll read it together. And this time, you will understand every word." The room fell into a quiet, not an awkward quiet, not a fearful one, just a full one, like a held breath released in unison. Meanwhile, Crescent's name was quietly disappearing from donor lists. Several partner institutions paused their collaboration, pending the results of the federal review. Candace resigned via email. Victoria, still clinging to her title, was placed on indefinite administrative leave. There was no farewell party, no flowers, just a single line in an internal newsletter. As of this week, Victoria Rowe will be taking personal time to attend to matters outside the company. Eleanor never read the newsletter. She didn't need to. What she had built was never meant as punishment. It was proof. Proof that being ignored did not mean being erased. That surviving could be a strategy. That silence could be strength. The months passed. Whittaker Cummins grew. The workshops filled up. The garden behind the building, once overgrown with weeds, was now full of lavender, rosemary, and older women laughing in folding chairs. Eleanor walked among them one afternoon, nodding gently, her hands full of grant applications and volunteer forms. Someone had painted a sign above the back door. This place exists because someone didn't give up. She hadn't. Not when they laughed, not when they dismissed her, not even when they forgot who she was. Because she remembered. She remembered all of it. And now, so would they. The seasons changed gently, at first unnoticed, spring sliding into summer, and with it came more women. They arrived quietly, some on foot, others dropped off by grandchildren or caregivers who didn't ask too many questions. They didn't come for charity. They came because they'd heard whispers about a place where they were seen, not studied. Eleanor greeted each one with the same quiet gesture and open hands, offering not answers, but presence. Each week, Whittaker Cummins added a new layer. A rack for translated forms. A reading corner with magnifying glasses. A tech station where someone like Marion, an 80-year-old widow who had never touched a laptop, could learn how to send an email or check her pension account without feeling like a burden. They'd hired a part-time counselor. 2 volunteers came twice a week to serve soup and review documents. The place began to hum with a rhythm Eleanor recognized from her earliest days at the clinic. Structured, but gentle. Efficient, but kind. It wasn't perfect. The pipes still rattled, and sometimes the lights flickered if the microwave and the copy machine were used at the same time. But it was alive. It was becoming something no boardroom could ever define. One Thursday morning, Eleanor was helping a woman named Beatrice understand a loan agreement when Nina rushed in with her phone in her hand, breathless. "They're talking about you," she whispered, setting the phone on the desk and turning the screen. It was a local news report. Not a headline, just a human interest segment tucked between the sports scores and the weather. The caption read, "Former healthcare worker launches financial resource center for senior women." A photo of Eleanor flashed briefly, an old one from her clinic days, blurry but unmistakable. The reporter was standing in front of Whittaker Cummins, describing the free services, the growing attendance, the impact. A few women in the room gasped. One clapped. Eleanor said nothing. She just turned back to Beatrice and said softly, "Let's finish page 4. But something had shifted. By that weekend, more visitors arrived. Some came from out of town. A bus of retirees from Carson City. A widow from Pahrump whose daughter had seen the video online. They came with folders clutched to their chests, afraid their questions would make them look ignorant. Eleanor met each one with the same grace, a chair, a cup of tea, and time. She knew now this wasn't just a program. It was a reckoning. A quiet revolution led not by protest signs, but by properly filed forms and names spoken with care. Meanwhile, within the fading halls of Crescent's corporate office, the silence was no longer dignified. It was heavy. Half the staff had been reassigned. The third-floor offices were empty, the lights turned off. The glass doors that once bore Victoria's name were wiped clean. A printed sign now read, "Office temporarily closed." Internal memos circulated about restructuring, legal settlements, reputation, restoration. Victoria remained silent, her email deactivated, her phone lines disconnected. No one knew where she had gone. Some said she left the country. Others whispered she was still in the city, hidden behind drawn curtains in a house that used to be filled with dinner parties and investment talk. Eleanor never asked. She didn't need to. She never needed Victoria's apology, only her absence. One late August evening, as the breeze carried the first hint of fall, Eleanor stood overlooking the garden behind Whittaker Cummins. The rosemary had grown wild. The lavender bowed over the pathway as if in a grateful curtsy. She watched as 2 women she'd helped months ago now led a session on pension fraud, confident, articulate, glowing. It wasn't about Eleanor anymore. It never really was. It was about them. About every woman who was ever told to be grateful for scraps, while others feasted at her expense. As the sun lowered and laughter rose from the tables in the back, Eleanor quietly walked away, leaving them to lead. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost in someone else's story, but like the beginning of something whole, rooted, and finally real. As autumn settled in, slow and golden, the mornings at Whittaker Cummins grew quieter, not from a lack of activity, but from a new kind of peace. The women arrived earlier now, not with fear or confusion, but with a familiar stride, greeting each other like neighbors, hugging, sharing recipes, offering rides. It had become more than a resource center. It was a rhythm now, a community with its own heartbeat. Eleanor usually arrived just after dawn, before the first workshop began, unlocking the front door with the same sense of purpose she used to enter operating rooms decades ago. She would make the tea, check the supply closet, water the stubborn ivy that refused to climb the front trellis. And then, before the first voice broke the quiet, she would pause in the hallway, just for a second, to listen. Footsteps on tile, the low hum of printers, distant laughter from the garden. It was a sound she never wanted to forget. 2 new programs launched that month. A mentorship circle pairing retired professionals with women starting second careers, and a legal literacy forum focused on housing rights and end-of-life documents. The latter drew more attendees than expected. Eleanor wasn't surprised. She'd always known that most women her age didn't fear death. They feared being misunderstood before they got there. She taught the first session herself, standing before a whiteboard with 5 colored markers, diagramming wills and powers of attorney with the same calm she used to explain heart conditions to nervous families. Her hands trembled slightly now, but her voice did not. A woman named Catherine raised her hand halfway through and said, "You make it feel possible, like it's not too late to fix things." Eleanor smiled. It's never too late to understand your own power. Meanwhile, outside of Whittaker Cummins, the ripples were expanding. A regional newspaper ran a profile on the project under the headline, "The Quiet Architect of Accountability." Eleanor's name wasn't in the title, but it didn't need to be. The article spoke of a woman who was once laughed out of a bank lobby and was now at the helm of a network no one saw coming. A few days after it ran, donations began arriving in quiet envelopes and online transfers, many anonymous. Some had notes tucked inside. "This is for my grandmother. She never had her chance. I remember you from the mobile clinic days. You once gave me cough syrup and a coupon for eggs. Keep going." The last note came from a familiar hand, Paul's. It was short, handwritten, and folded neatly inside a modest check. "I should have said something. I see that now. I'm sorry, Mom." Eleanor read it twice, then placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk under a folder labeled letters. She didn't cry. She didn't even sigh. She just sat still for a moment, her hands resting gently in her lap, and whispered, "Thank you for finally seeing." She never wrote back. Some wounds didn't need words. They just needed time. One cold evening, she stayed after hours to restock the shelves. The office was empty, the lights soft. Reaching for the reams of paper on top of the filing cabinet, she noticed a framed photo had slipped behind the printer, one of the few she kept at her desk. It was an early one, black and white, taken outside the old mobile clinic van. Eleanor and Caroline stood side by side, wind in their hair, arms crossed, tired but undefeated. She picked it up, wiped the dust from the corner, and looked at it for a long time. So much had changed. The city, the systems, the people around her, but not her heart. That was still the same, worn, yes, but strong. She put the photo back in its place, adjusted it carefully, and then turned out the lights. Outside, the street was nearly silent. The sky was navy blue, the stars quiet but watchful. Eleanor walked slowly to the corner, pulling her coat over her shoulders. She didn't need to hurry. What she had built would still be there tomorrow. And for once, so would she not as someone waiting to be remembered, but as someone whose presence had already rewritten the silence. The first snow came early that year, a light dusting that coated the city in white and made it seem softer than it really was. Eleanor sat by her apartment window that morning, watching the flakes gather on the railing, coffee cupped in both hands, the steam rising gently to her face. The world looked different when it was quiet, cleaner, slower. But she knew better than anyone that beauty could be deceiving. Just beneath the frost were sidewalks that cracked under pressure and roots that pushed against the concrete like secrets refusing to stay buried. Still, she cherished the moment. This winter felt different than the last. She was no longer invisible. She had reclaimed something not just for herself, but for everyone who was ever hushed by politeness, dismissed by power, or erased by paperwork. The phone buzzed on the counter. Nina again, texting about an urgent grant application. Eleanor smiled and typed a quick reply, then put on her coat. She had a meeting at City Hall. A councilwoman had taken an interest in Whittaker Cummins and wanted to talk about expanding the model to other neighborhoods. Eleanor wasn't sure she wanted to expand, not yet at least, but she would listen. Listening, after all, had always been her truest gift. The council building was a cold structure, glass and steel, echoing with the footsteps of people who believed they mattered more than they did. But Eleanor walked through it calmly. No makeup, no fancy purse. Just a folder in her hand and the kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. The councilwoman was young, educated, and a little too eager. She spoke quickly about scale, matching funds, and municipal partnerships. Eleanor listened for 15 minutes, then held up a gentle hand. "Do you know who this is for?" she asked. The young woman blinked. "It's for financial equity. For at-risk seniors." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "It's for women who stopped asking for help because they got tired of being patronized. It's for women who raised everyone else and now sit alone wondering if anyone remembers their birthdays. It's for the ones who were told to sign here, wait there, be quiet forever." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was telling. The councilwoman nodded slowly. "I'd like to visit," she said, almost a whisper. Eleanor smiled. "Then don't wear heels. You'll be on your feet for a while." That night, as the sky turned to slate and the snow continued to fall in delicate sheets, Eleanor returned to Whittaker Cummins. The heat was rattling, and someone had tracked mud onto the entry rug. A woman sat in the reception area, waiting patiently. Her name was Martha. She had just turned 70, wore thick glasses, and held a manila envelope in both hands as if it contained her last chance at dignity. "They told me to come here," Martha said softly, almost ashamed. "I think I signed something wrong last year. They said it's too late to fix it." Eleanor gestured to the chair opposite her. "That's what they always say when they don't want you to ask questions. Show me what you have." Martha handed over the papers, her fingers trembling slightly. Eleanor unfolded them carefully, her eyes moving with slow precision. It was a reverse mortgage agreement, loaded with legalese and backdated adjustments. But there was a clause, an opening. "They misled you," she said, her voice steady. "We can challenge this." Martha's mouth fell open. "Are you sure?" Eleanor nodded. "I've seen worse, and I've watched them fall apart under the weight of the truth." Martha wiped at her eyes. "I didn't think anyone would take the time." Eleanor took her hand. "Time is what we give each other. It's the only way anything ever changes." Outside, the snow piled higher. The cars slowed. The streetlights came on, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Inside, the warmth gathered in the corners from the radiators, yes, but also something less mechanical, something human. Eleanor stayed late that night, helping Martha draft an appeal. The clock on the wall ticked off the seconds with a steady constancy, and every tick felt like another stitch in something that was healing. Not just for Martha, not just for Eleanor, but for every woman who ever sat quietly in the back of a room, waiting for someone to finally say, "We'll fix this together." The following spring, the flowers in the Whittaker Cummins garden bloomed earlier than usual. Thick clusters of tulips pushed up from the soil, bold and unapologetic, as if the earth itself had decided not to wait for permission. Eleanor stood at the edge of the plot, watering can in hand, her loose cardigan draped over her shoulders. She had taken to coming to the garden before the others arrived, not for the quiet, though she cherished it, but to remember, to feel, even now, the weight and wonder of all that had happened. Whittaker Cummins was no longer just a place, it was a movement. One that had grown not from headlines or funding drives, but from hands held across tables, from questions asked gently, from silences broken on purpose. A year ago, she had stood alone on a sidewalk outside a pharmacy with an empty prescription bag and a daughter-in-law who laughed in her face. Now, she was surrounded by women who had found not just their voices, but each other. The board had recently voted to open 2 more locations, one across the river, another in a rural town where a financial literacy class had never existed. Eleanor had agreed, on one condition. Each new site had to be run by women over the age of 60, not as a symbol, but as a statement, proof that age does not mean obsolescence, it means experience. And experience is a currency. Inside the building, the sound of shifting chairs and soft conversation began to drift out the window. A new workshop was about to begin. Eleanor walked in slowly, her knees stiffer now, but her stride was deliberate. The walls were covered in posters. Know your rights, understanding probate, medical debt, what they don't tell you. By the reception desk, a corkboard was filled with hand-pinned photos. Women smiling, holding certificates. Testimonials written in shaky but determined script. Thank you notes, stories of victory. And in the center, a framed message. This is not charity. This is reclamation. The guest speaker that morning was Elise, the same woman who had once stood silently behind Victoria's desk at Crescent. She now taught financial ethics at the community college and volunteered 3 days a week. As Eleanor entered, Elise looked up, smiled, and gave a small nod. Around the room, familiar faces looked back at her: Martha, Catherine, Nina. Each held a pen in her hand, not just to take notes, but to rewrite the end of a story they once thought was finished. Eleanor took a seat in the back. She didn't need to lead every session anymore. That was the point. She had built something that did not depend on her presence, something that would endure long after she was gone. As the session began, she folded her hands in her lap, letting Elise's voice fill the room like sunlight filtering through the blinds. The topic was legacy, not in the sense of wealth or property, but in the form of dignity, control, self-respect. Eleanor looked around the room and thought of all the things she had once wanted to be heard, to be seen, to matter. She had that now. Not through revenge, not through wealth, not through public approval, but through impact, through persistence, through presence. A presence that refused to be small. Outside, the wind stirred the garden gate. A young volunteer walked past with a binder and paused when she saw Eleanor. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Eleanor smiled. "More than okay." The young woman nodded, not sure what to say next. But Eleanor knew. "You know," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "the world doesn't change all at once. It tilts. Just enough for the light to get in. You keep holding that light. That's the work." The young woman nodded again, understanding a little more now. Eleanor turned her gaze back to the group. She no longer felt like a woman who had been put aside. She felt like the reason another one never would be. That was enough. That was everything.